Alright, so welcome back to Train Signal. You're watching Setting Up Who Gets to Do What with a Website. We're going to be talking about how to control access to a website, more on the managerial side with IIS 7's Manager and some FTP tools. And just to make it a little more interesting, we're also going to set up a little bit of SMTP along the way as well. So in this video, we're going to talk about what it is and why we might need to provide management access to IIS 7. We'll talk about the GlobalMantics custom web application that's going to be set up by a web developer. Okay? Now, we don't have to develop it. Hank's already got somebody hired to do that kind of work, but we are going to have to support him. So we'll talk about what that's going to mean for us as the GlobalMantics administrator. Then we're going to talk about how to get FTP up and running. Now, FTP is a really easy way to get files uploaded and downloaded back and forth from a web server. So I'll show you how to do that. And then, of course, I'm going to talk to you about how to install and get Send Mail Transfer Protocol, SMTP, set up so our SharePoint server can actually email folks alerts and whatever else the web developer decides that he's going to be creating for that kind of functionality. Alright, so let's go ahead and let's talk about our GlobalMantics custom web application scenario here. Well, we have SharePoint, but Hank's okay with it, but he's not really convinced that it has everything that it needs. There isn't enough features that are specific to the business of brokering stocks and securities. So he's hired a developer that's going to be customizing SharePoint for GlobalMantics. And by the way, if you don't know who Hank is, this is Hank, all right? Now, of course, supporting this new developer falls on your shoulders because, well, you're the system administrator. So what we need to do, now that we've created the SharePoint site, is we need to allow management access to that site for the developer. And so I'm going to show you how to get that done. What we need to do in order to make that happen is, first of all, we need to enable remote management, all right? And we're also going to need to allow for IIS Manager credentials. We're going to need to create an IIS Manager user account for our developer. Now, this is going to be different than our account creation for Active Directory. Okay, this is a specific user account that is only for IIS, and that's the only place where this will be used at. All right, so IIS has its own little authentication mechanism built right into it. Now, the advantage to doing that is we're going to be able to provide specific access for the SharePoint site for that developer's account. Now, here's the thing. We want to allow our developer to do his work sitting at his own desk and not have to be running into the server room all the time. So once we have all of this set up, I'm going to show you how to install the IIS Manager client on a Vista box, so that way the web developer can manage the SharePoint site, do whatever he needs to do with it, but he doesn't have to ask us to do stuff. He doesn't have to walk into the server room. He'll be able to do everything sitting at his cushy little desk. All right. Now, also, management is one thing, but we also need to allow our SharePoint developer to transfer files back and forth between his machine and the SharePoint box. Okay, so we're going to install FTP, File Transfer Protocol Access, for our developer. We're going to set that up for him so he can use pretty much any FTP client that he likes. He can use the built-in stuff in Vista. He can use FileZilla, whatever he wants to use, but we have to set up FTP on the server first. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to get that done. So we'll start there. Once we get this accomplished, then we'll talk a little more about the whole SMTP thing, okay? So let's go ahead and let's bounce on over to the server. Let's get this remote management stuff started, and then we'll proceed on from there. Alright, so we're back over here on our web server, and you'll see here that I'm in the Server Manager. I'm underneath the web server IIS, and then I'm here in the Internet Information IIS Manager. This is where we're going to be doing all of the work that I just told you about, at least initially, until we get to the FTP stuff. By the way, we can also get to this interface if you want it in a separate window by going to Start, Administrative Tools, and IIS Manager. Okay. Now, you'll see here that I also have the IIS 6 Manager. That got installed during our initial installation process. You'll see why that's going to be important for us when we get to the SMTP stuff, okay? Because we're going to manage our SMTP from the IIS 6.0 Manager instead of here, although we're going to need to do some stuff with SMTP in the regular manager as well. I just want to show you that you can get to it from both places. I have become addicted to the server manager, and I don't see any reason to use anything else. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn off this console tree over here so you can see the bigger picture over here, and I can always turn it back on if I wanted to too. But just allow me the maximum view of this particular component. All right, so here's what we're going to do. Right now you see that I have selected Web 1 Globo over here in the connections. Now, just so you know how to get to this, by the way, if I go here to Web 1 Globo, that will bring up this nice push button kind of interface. I'm going to scroll down, and here underneath Management, I'm going to go to Management Service. And from here, I'm going to enable remote connections, so this will allow for that capability to be open. Then I need to decide whether or not I'm going to use Windows credentials only, or Windows credentials, or IIS Manager credentials. Now this is kind of a toss-up. You can use Active Directory accounts if you like, but I think for the time being, in order to illustrate everything that this thing is capable of, I'm going to go ahead and utilize Windows credentials or IIS Manager credentials. Now you're here, okay? All right, so now underneath connections, we're going to leave this as it is, all unassigned for the IP address. And I want you to take special note of the number that is right here. This number might be different on your particular installation, but this port number is going to be critical for us when we actually go to try to administrate this remotely from the IIS 7.0 Manager console we're going to install a little later on. So just kind of pencil this down here. I'm going to remember that is 8172. That's going to become important for us later on. Everything else I can pretty much leave as it is, unless I want to specify IP version 4 address restrictions. So if I want to make sure that some machines do not get access to this at all, I could specify and create allow and deny items here. You're probably going to want to do this if in fact you really need to lock down your IIS server. But this, remember, is only for managing IIS, not for actual website access, okay? Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and click on Apply. And now you see over here in the alerts that it tells me that I need to start the management service. You notice here that the management service is stopped. You cannot turn remote management on or off if your management service is actually running. So keep that in mind. If you're unable to actually get to the management console, actually make a connection to the server, make sure that your management service is actually turned on. Let's go ahead and do that now by clicking on Start. And it might take just a little bit for it to click open. But you'll notice here that as soon as the management service starts and stop and restart become available, everything over here becomes grayed out. I can't make any more alterations to the management service section of IIS until I stop the console, okay? Notice here it just tells me the management service must be stopped before making changes to the service configuration. Alright, just told you that. So we're good for this one, alright? Let's go ahead and go back to Web 1 Globo. And I'm going to go ahead and double click here and get back to the push button interface. I'm going to scroll on down now back to the management section. Now what I need to do is I need to create IIS Manager users. Okay, so I need to create a user account specifically in IIS for our web developer to use. So I'm going to go ahead and double click here on IIS Manager. You'll notice that there's no users here whatsoever. And I'm going to click on Add User. Alright, so I need to just create a quick user account here. We're just going to name this one SharePoint Guy. Okay. There we go, and we'll create a quick password for him. Now remember, this is not an Active Directory account, right? This is an IIS Manager account. Big difference, two completely different things. Now you notice over here in the actions, I could add more users. I could change this user's password. I could disable the user, or I could even remove the user if I so desired. Alright, so SharePoint Guy has been set up. Now that we've created the user account, let's go ahead and let's go back over here to our connection section and underneath sites, okay? You know what, I've got a couple of websites in here that I really don't need, like this Globo Internet that I created for you earlier just to show you how to create a new website. creating other websites along with SharePoint, not such a great idea. Okay, if it's going to be a SharePoint box, let it be a SharePoint box. And also this default website, I don't need it either because this is going to be strictly a SharePoint box. I'm going to remove the default website that got installed with IIS as well. So now all that's left is the SharePoint site as well as the SharePoint Central Administration site. Now this is a specific web application that is for high-level SharePoint administrative tasks. I'll show you what that website looks like a little later on, all right? But for right now, we need to concern ourselves with the SharePoint site itself. So I'm going to click here on the SharePoint-80 site. I'm going to scroll down, and then I need to come back here to the management section and go into IIS Manager Positions. Now what I'm doing is I am going to allow our SharePoint developer to only access this one particular website. I do that by coming over here and clicking on Allow User. What type of user am I going to select? Is it going to be somebody from Active Directory, which is the Windows stuff here? Nope. I'm going to allow the IIS Manager account. I'm going to click on Select. Here's my SharePoint Guy user account I just created, and I'm going to tell it OK. So when we do get our IIS Manager console installed on Vista, when our web developer goes to manage the IIS SharePoint site, he's going to have to log in with SharePoint Guy. He's not going to be able to use his regular credentials. I'm going to tell this OK, and that's all there is to it. So what I've done successfully at this stage in the game is I have enabled remote management. I've created the SharePoint Guy account, and I have allowed access for the SharePoint Guy account only for the SharePoint 80 site. Okay, and by the way, 80 is just the port number that it runs on, which is of course the standard HTTP port, right? Now if I want to also give access to the SharePoint Central Administration website, I need to kind of rinse and repeat that process. So now that I'm on the SharePoint Central Administration home, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of the page, go into IIS Manager Permissions. Once again, you'll see that I have nobody. Let's go ahead and give SharePoint Guy access to the Central Administration website as well, just in case he needs it. Alright, so I'm going to tell it OK, and there we go. Alright, so what we need to do next, now that this is enabled, we're going to switch over to a Vista client, and I'm going to show you where to go to find the IIS Manager 7 for Vista Manager, so that way we can get that installed. And by the way, I actually already have it installed because I didn't want to waste your time by showing you, well, here's how to install some software. Well, you already know how to install some software, so I'm going to just give you a quick tour of where to go find that stuff at, as well as where to go find the IIS Manager client. Then I'll show you how to connect remotely to our IIS Manager for the SharePoint sites, okay? Alright, so here I am actually on the Vista client that I'm using to record with. I'm not actually on a virtual machine this time around, but I want to show you what it is that you're going to need first before you can install the IIS 7 Manager. First of all, you need to be at Service Pack 1 for Vista if you're using a Vista client. Now, if you're using an XP client, by the way, you need to be at Service Pack 3. Just FYI. Now you can also install the IIS Manager that I'm going to show to you here in just a second on Server 2003 as well. So if you have a Server 2003 box you want to use for remote management, that is also possible. So Service Pack 1 for Vista or Service Pack 3 for Windows XP. Next, I'm going to take you over here to the Start menu. I'm going to go to the Control Panel next. I want to show you something else that you need to have enabled before you even think about trying to get this installed. So I'm going to go here to Programs and Features and turn Windows Features on or off. And now I'm going to wait for this guy to populate it for just a second here. And I'm going to go over here to Internet Information Services. I'm going to expand this. And Web Management Tools. Okay, this IIS Management Console item needs to be turned on first. Okay, if you don't have this turned on, when you go to install the IIS 7.0 Manager, it's going to cuss at you and say, hey, you need to go back and turn this on first. Okay, so this is required to have turned on. Let's go ahead and cancel this, and I'm going to close out of the control panel. Next, I'm going to go to Internet Explorer here. I'm jumping right here to IIS.net. Okay, this is where you go to in order to download this remote management console for IIS 7. Now I'm going to go here to the download section. And you know what? There's all kinds of really good stuff in here. So if you get a chance, make sure you go to this website. There's a lot of great tutorials. There's a lot of good downloadable management items. But here is the IIS 7 Manager for Remote Administration. Now you notice that this is the 32-bit edition, the x86 edition, if you will. So if you're going to install this on a 32-bit edition, this is what you would need. If you're going to be installing it on a 64-bit edition, then you absolutely have to have Internet Information Manager for 64-bit. So I'll tell you what, let's do here real quick. Let's go ahead and let's just grab this text. I'm going to copy this, and I do know for a fact that my version of Vista is actually 64-bit, so I'm going to do a quick search for the 64-bit edition. Here we go. Internet Information Services 7.0 Manager for 64-bit. There we go. I'm going to scroll down here. This is a free download, by the way. And I want to show you and have you pay close attention to the requirements. First of all, like I told you, you must have Vista Service Pack 1 installed. You must also have the Microsoft.NET framework installed. That's also a free download. But if you're running Vista Business, chances are you probably already have that. You must have the Internet Information Services 7.0 Management Console installed. That's what I just showed you. And it also tells you that the 32-bit edition of IIS 7 will not function correctly on 64-bit. Yeah, no kidding. All right, now, I also told you that you can install it on Service Pack 3. Well, looks like I was jumping the gun a little bit. Service Pack 2, sorry about that. And then also Windows 2003 Service Pack 1 if you want to install it on Server 2K3, okay? All right, let's scroll back up top here. And I can just go ahead and I can click on this download button. It is a Microsoft MSI package, so I could just run it or I could save it. Now, I've actually already installed it. So it's just a typical software installation. There's really nothing special about the install for it. As long as you have the prerequisites, the system requirements, you're going to be A-OK. Alright, so now that you know where to go for this and you know how to find it, again, it's just at IIS.net. I'm going to go ahead and close this out here. So now I'm going to go to the Start menu, and in Vista, the easiest way to find it is just type in IIS, and then that should bring it up here. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and click on it and bring up the IIS Manager console. And how about that, huh? So now what we need to do is we need to connect our IIS 7 console either to a server, to a site, or to an application. Well, what we did is we set up our IIS Manager console access for SharePoint Guy only on the SharePoint sites. So I'm going to click on Connect to a Site. And now it's going to bring up this little wizard guy here. So now we need to put in the server name. So we're going to do Web1 Globo. Actually, you know what? There's something I need to do first. I'm going to put in a colon, and we need to connect on a very specific port, 8172. Remember that number that I was telling you about earlier that I wanted you to kind of jot down? Well, make sure that whenever you're setting up your management console that you jot that down. Otherwise, you're going to have to run back over to your server and figure out what that port is. Alright, so now we need to put in our site name, and you need to put this in exactly as that site is named. Otherwise, it's going to cuss at you and be angry and not let you in. Okay? So, alright, so now we're going to click on Next. And now we need to put in our username. Now, the username that we're going to use is, remember, not the Active Directory user account, because we don't have any access allowed for any Active Directory users, only for the IIS Manager account. So we're going to use SharePoint Guy, and then we'll go ahead and put in the password here. There we go, that's what we were looking for. Alright, so it's telling us that the certificate was issued to a different server. Let's click on, let's view the certificate. Let's make sure, yeah, that's the certificate, alright. Web1 Global. This certificate was actually generated when we originally set up SharePoint. We didn't do anything to generate this certificate, just so you know. Alright, since we are going to trust this, we're going to go ahead and we'll click on Install Certificate. So that way we don't always end up having to get this box over and over and over again. So we'll tell that OK, and then connect. And now what should happen is we should, hey, there we go, created a new connection successfully. We'll go ahead and we'll leave it as SharePoint, that's fine. We'll click on Finish, and there we go. Now we have a live connection to our IIS manager. But look over here, look, it's only for the SharePoint site that we specified, right? If we wanted to connect to the central administration, then we would have to go back and put in that SharePoint central administration name site instead of the SharePoint 80. Alright, so now at this stage in the game, our developer could go in and make alterations to whatever he has access to. So we've got a basic core access point, but we haven't really provided a way for our developer to transfer files back and forth. So what we're going to do next is we're going to set up FTP. So that way our developer will be able to transfer files back and forth quickly and easily, again, sitting from his desktop. Alright, so before we get into that though, I wanted to bounce you back on over to the slides. Let's talk about it just a little bit. Alright, so let's talk about FTP. First of all, FTP is actually a role service, okay, and it's a super easy way to get files uploaded to the server and download files from the server as well. We've been using it in the web world for a long time, but it is installed as a role service, really an optional part of IIS. That's what I want you to remember, okay? When you go to install FTP, you'll actually go to a very different section. You won't go to the roles per se. You actually go to the web server role, and we'll actually install it using these items right here. Okay. Now here's the thing. Once we enable and install FTP for IIS, we're also going to need to restrict FTP access only for your web developer. So I'll show you how to do that to make sure that our web developer can only get into one particular section of the server. Even though he has access to the management console, we also might want to be careful about where we're allowing him to put stuff on the server. We may not want to give him full-blown local administrative access to that machine. We only want to give him access to the file folders that he absolutely needs. Okay, let's go ahead and let's bounce back on over to the server now, and let me show you how to get FTP installed. Alright, so back over here on our web server, we're pretty much good to go with the IIS management stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the console tree back on with the console tree button. And let's go to the web server section here. And I'm going to scroll on down here. And here are the role services that we currently have installed. We actually had installed when we did the initial application server / IIS installation. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's add the role services now. And we're going to scroll down here, and we're going to put a check mark in FTP Publishing Service. Now there's two components to FTP Publishing Service. We have the FTP server itself here, and then we actually have the FTP Management Console. Now I want to mention something up here to you. The FTP Management Console provides infrastructure to manage an FTP site. IIS 7 uses IIS 6 Management Console. Okay. We remember that little IIS Management Console I was talking to you about for IIS 6? That's going to come into play here. Alright, so let's go ahead and let's tell it next. And we'll go ahead and we'll install this guy real quick. And I'm going to pause the video while this is installing. It shouldn't prompt me for a restart, by the way, because it's just a role service. Alright, as soon as this guy's done installing, I'll come right back and take you on to the next step. Alright, so FTP has successfully installed, so let me go ahead and take you on over and show you where we're going to find this at now. We're going to go to the Start menu, and then we're going to go to Administrative Tools, and we're going to go to Internet Information Services IIS 6.0 Manager, not the 7 Manager. Alright, you notice here that I also have it hanging out here. I'll go ahead and click on it. It doesn't make any difference really which place you go to. This is one of the few things that you're not going to find inside of your server manager. Most of the stuff you're going to find smack dab in there, but this is one of the few exceptions. I'm going to go ahead and expand out here, and let's see, we have FTP sites. I'm going to expand it, and here we have the default FTP site that was installed when I installed this particular role service. So I'm going to select it. You notice that there's a little red item here. It's telling me that this service is stopped, so that's no good. Let's go ahead and start this service up. And there we go. Alright, so right now you see that there's no items to show. Let's go ahead and let's right click on this guy. And we're going to go to its properties. Let me go ahead and take you in here and show you how to more deeply configure this guy. Alright, so first of all we have the name of the site. Let's go ahead and let's call this SharePoint. We'll call this SharePoint FTP. And now we need to decide what IP address are we going to use, or we could use all unassigned. Let's go ahead and let's specify the very specific IP address for our SharePoint machine, which is 192.168.5.15. Now we can also choose which port we want to use for FTP. Well, by default, most FTP applications use port 21, so that's what we're going to stick to. Now we also can decide what FTP site connection do we want unlimited, or do we want to limit those connections. I'll go ahead and we'll leave it at the defaults. And do we want to use logging or not to see if and when we have any problems? Alright, so let's go to security counts now. Now right now we're allowing anonymous connections. I'm not real crazy about that, so we're actually going to turn off anonymous connections. So basically what we're doing is we're specifying that a user has to have a very specific account in order to have access to the FTP site. That is what we want to happen. We don't want anyone being able to log in using FTP to our SharePoint server. And I know that the obvious security issues are already springing to mind, right? Now it's telling me that the authentication option you have selected results in passwords being transmitted over the network without data encryption. Someone attempting to compromise your system security could use a protocol analyzer to examine user passwords during the authentication process. For more detail on user authentication, consult the online help. This warning does not apply to HTTPS or SSL connections. Are you sure you want to continue? Yes, I am. Now, here's the thing that I want to tell you right up front. If you're going to use this built-in role service using the IIS 6 manager, you do not get secure FTP. Okay? This is a big deal. FTP, by default, is not the most secure protocol in the universe. It's really only used for transferring files back and forth between a server. Now here's the thing, if we are already inside of the router and we know that our web developer is only going to be doing stuff while he's on the premises and he's not going to be connecting to the server when he's outside, out in the quote-unquote real world, then this is probably going to be okay. Now unless of course someone actually comes into the company and is on the inside of the router, are we really going to have to worry? But that's a physical security issue and not a protocol level security issue. Alright, so messages, we can set up any messages that we want to. I'm going to skip those for the time being. But this one is big, the home directory. Okay, what file folder are we going to allow our users to connect to? Alright, now right now it's set at inetpub FTP root. Alright, let's click on Browse, and let's get a little more specific here. Now, we could give access directly to the whole inetpub thing. I'm not really sure I'm comfortable with that because, quite frankly, all our web developer really needs access to is this WSS folder. Now, this is the folder that was created when we installed SharePoint services. So you'll see here that we have the SharePoint virtual directories. We have port 80. This is our default SharePoint site, and this is the administration site. We'll get to that a little bit later. So let's go ahead and let's give our web developer access to this WSS folder here. We'll tell this one OK. And we also want to give write access as well as read access, and we want to log visits. Now here in the directory listing style, do we prefer a Unix listing style or MS-DOS file style? Well, since our web developer is more of a Microsoft type, we'll leave it in MS-DOS, but let's say our web developer is more of a Linux, Unix folk. Well, in that case, then we'd probably utilize the Unix system, but we'll go ahead and leave it at MS-DOS. Now let's take a look here in directory security. Here's kind of a fun security element. We could actually deny or allow access to a very specific computer based upon the IP address. So if I wanted to do that here, let's go ahead and we'll click on Add. I could go ahead and specify the IP address of, let's say, a particular client. Let's say it's 128, and we tell it OK. Now let's go ahead and let's remove this guy here. All computers will be denied access except for that one particular machine here. There we go. So now all computers are denied access except the machine that has the address 192.168.5.128. Now if we want to allow our web developer to access the FTP anywhere he happens to be at, well, we may want to remove that and specify granted access. Now that's a lot of permissions. Okay, so there's a pretty big hole there in terms of our access to the FTP on the server. For the time being, I'm going to allow this to go on. Now if I want to get very specific about the FTP security, this is going to be a different story, right? But for the time being, I'm going to allow any computer to have access to FTP. So no matter where our web developer is logged in at, he can go ahead and have FTP access to the SharePoint server. Alright, so we've set up our default FTP setup here. We have created, or really renamed it to be SharePoint FTP. There's one more thing that we need to do. Let's right click and let's go into permissions here. Alright, so what we need to do now is we need to make sure that our web developer account actually has access and permissions to this particular FTP site. So let's go ahead and click on the edit button here. And let's go ahead and let's add in our web developer's account. And so I'm going to go ahead and add in, and by the way, this particular Active Directory account was already created. Looks like it's going to force me to put in my administrative credentials, and I actually renamed the administrator account to Supercoach, just so you know. Always a good idea to rename your administrator account because everybody knows that the default administrator account is named administrator, right? Okay, so now web developer we're going to go ahead and tell this OK, and let's go ahead and see what kind of access that we have provided by default. This is read and execute, list folder contents, and read. Well, that's not really what we want. We're going to go ahead and we're going to provide full control to our web developer for this particular FTP site and folder set. As a developer, I can guarantee he's going to want and need that. Alright, let's go ahead and tell that OK. And there we have it. Okay, let's go ahead and make sure, just double check. Alright, web developer, full control, we're A-OK on that. So, what did we do? We made sure we set up our FTP site to make sure that it directed to the appropriate folder set. And now we have added our user so that he can actually log in with his web developer account. We'll tell this OK. So now at this stage in the game, our FTP site should be functional. So now what we're going to do is we're going to test it. All right. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to actually move over to a Vista client, and we're going to test out the web developer account to see if he can actually get connected to the FTP site. Now what we'll do to test it is we'll actually use the command line FTP option. I'll show you what that'll look like here in just a moment. Alright, so here we are back on a Vista client, and you'll notice here that the web developer account is actually logged in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the command prompt, and I'm going to test out the FTP connectivity by typing FTP. And I'm going to go ahead and see if I can open up 192.168.5.15, which is the address of our FTP site. There we go. Okay, well, we are connected. This is good news. So now let's go ahead and let's see if we can log in. I'm going to use globalmantics/webdeveloper. And looks like the password is required. There's a big surprise, right? We'll go ahead and put in the password for web developer. And we are successfully logged in. Fantastic. So now we know that our web developer can actually use pretty much any FTP client that he likes. Again, whether it be FileZilla or the built-in FTP for Windows Explorer, whatever it might be, our web developer now has FTP access. So he has management access through IIS 7 Manager and FTP access so we can transfer files back and forth. Now the good news is, let's go ahead and let's log out of this here real quick, if I try to log in anonymously, and we'll just do the same thing here. If I try to log in with nobody, nope. I cannot log in anonymously to the FTP server. Remember, we turned that functionality off, right? So that only our web developer gets access to that FTP protocol for this particular website. All right, so we are successful, but you know what? There's something that just came in, just went across my desk that I need to tell you about. Let's flip on over back to the slides real quick. All right, I've just received some breaking news that there is a new FTP manager for IIS 7. Now, here's the thing. Remember how I was telling you that FTP by default is not secure, right? Well, if you want to use secure FTP with IIS 7, we actually need to go out to Microsoft.com and get a brand new FTP manager service. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to show you how to do that. Now, in order for this to work, I'm also going to have to uninstall the old FTP server service. All right, so let's go ahead and let's bounce on over. We're going to uninstall the old one. We're going to go out to Microsoft.com. We're going to download the new IIS 7 FTP Manager for Server 2008. All right, so we're back over here on Web 1, as you can see. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of Internet Information Services 6.0 Manager, and we're going to need to uninstall that role service for IIS 6. Let's scroll down here in the Server Manager. And we're under here underneath Web Server IIS. Now make sure that you're down here and not up underneath Application Server, okay? I'm going to go ahead and click on Remove Role Services for IIS. And we're going to uninstall the work that we just did for the FTP Publishing Service. Again, this is the built-in stuff. We're going to go ahead and tell it next. And remove. And it's going to take a little while, so while this thing is actually removing the old services, we're going to go out to Microsoft.com and we're going to download the new FTP service for IIS 7. All right, so Internet Enhanced Security is currently configured. That's really going to be annoying, but we're going to go ahead and tough it out here. To go get, actually we need to go not to Microsoft.com, I'm sorry, I'm lying to you. We need to go to IIS.net in order to get this particular download. Oh good, here we go. Content from the website is blocked. Alright, let's go ahead and let's add IIS.net. This is really going to get on our nerves very, very quickly. But here's the deal. This is probably not something that you want to turn off on your server. Okay, just so you know. I'm just going to go ahead and keep on closing and closing. And we'll just block these particular elements on the page. Wow, is this really annoying or what? Holy cow, I just keep closing stuff out. How many ads are there? Okay, looks like we have gotten out of the ads. Let's go to Get Popular Downloads, okay? And oh look, here we go again. Ads. Oh, ads. Are we going to get another one? Nope. Okay, good deal. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and scroll down the page here. And what I'm looking for is the Microsoft FTP Publishing Service for IIS 7. Now you notice here this is actually the 32-bit version, but don't worry about that so much because you know what, I'm going to go ahead and go to, here we go again, I'm going to go ahead and go to that page because we should find a link for the 64-bit version because we are running 64-bit editions of Server 2008. After I get through all of the ads, holy cow, I'm going to scroll down here. Here we go. Please see the following URL for the 64-bit version. That's where we want to go to. And oh good, here we go again. More ads, 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 and some more ads. Whew. Okay. Microsoft FTP publishing service for IIS 7, 64-bit. That's what we want. Let's go and let's download this guy real quick. And it's a pretty small download, kind of a surprisingly small download. There we go. Let's go ahead and we'll save it. It's only 100 or 1.95 megabytes. We're going to go ahead and download this guy real quick. All right, we're going to save it to the desktop here, and we'll go ahead and we'll just leave the name as it is and save it down. All right, so up there, wow, super fast download. There we go. Let's go ahead and close that, and now we'll close Internet Explorer. And we'll go back over to Server Manager and we'll see how we're doing in terms of uninstalling the old FTP service. Well, looks like we are still removing here. Oh, looks like we're just about finished. But it does look like it's going to take maybe just a little while to collect those results. So I'm going to pause the recording, and then as soon as this guy is done, I'll come right back. Okay, looks like we must restart the server in order to finish the removal process. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Close now. And do we want to restart now? Yes, we do. Let's go ahead and do that. We'll tell it yes. Again, I'm going to pause, and then as soon as this guy is done restarting, I'll come right back and show you how to install that new FTP service. All right, there we go. We have a successful removal. Let's go ahead and close this guy. We should not have to restart again for this one. All right, let's go ahead and minimize our Server Manager, and now let's see if we can't install this FTP service. So we're going to double click. It's a very simplistic installation, nothing all that extravagant here. I'm going to tell it next, and I'm going to accept the license terms and tell it next. There's a few additional features here. We're going to go ahead and leave them as defaults and tell them next and install. And it's also a very fast installation, shouldn't take it very long at all. Now again, here's something that I really want to emphasize to you, is that if you want to have secure FTP using secure socket layer and certificates, you absolutely have to have this installed. Unless, of course, you have a third-party solution. There's always that option out there. But if you're going with the stuff that Microsoft provides, this is the way to go. All right, so now we can go ahead and click on the Finish button, and that should get it installed for us here. All right, looks like we have just a few notes about this new FTP service, the integration with IIS 7.0. Talks about the interface, yada yada. I'll let you read that at your leisure. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this guy out, and we'll go ahead and expand back our Server Manager, and now let's go into the roles. Let's go into IIS Web Server here, and we'll go into the IIS Service Manager section. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the console tree here so we can have a full look at what's happening, as full as we can anyway at this resolution. I'm going to expand Web 1 Globo, and I'm going to go into Sites just so we have that accessible. Now as I scroll down in the Web 1 Globo homepage here, you'll see now I have all of these fun FTP options. Hey, how about that, huh? Including the SSL settings if we so desire to have that. Now there's a couple of ways you could implement this really fast. Let's say we want to implement FTP for our SharePoint site. I'm going to right click, I'm going to select Add FTP Publishing, and now I can specify the address that it's going to go to. I can also specify a host name. I'm not going to do that initially for simplicity's sake. I can also start the FTP site automatically. Yep, and here is the SSL option. So if I want to allow for SSL, I could utilize a certificate, and this certificate, by the way, remember, this is the certificate that SharePoint installed for us automatically. I could go ahead and I could view the certificate real quick just to see what it looks like. Tell that guy okay. I want to tell it next. What kind of authentication do we want to use? Now, anonymous, again, anonymous is going to allow pretty much anyone to have access to the FTP site. Bad idea. We're going to stick to basic, and then authorization, we can select all users, anonymous users, specific roles or users group, or specified users. So now I could go ahead, I could specify my Globomantics web developer user, and I'm going to provide read and write permissions. And I'll go ahead and click on Finish. and that will provide FTP publishing for this particular website. Let's go ahead and click on SharePoint 80 and let's see if our FTP options are showing up. And now we'll scroll down here just a little bit and we should see the FTP options. Yep, there they are. So here are the FTP settings for our SharePoint site. Now, of course, if we wanted to allow FTP access for SharePoint Central Administration, we could do that as well by right-clicking and adding FTP publishing. Now, let me show you one more way that you can create FTP capability for this. I'm going to right-click on Sites here, and instead of select Add Website, I could also add an FTP site. Now, is there a significant advantage to using this over another? Well, in this one we can actually provide a little bit wider scope in terms of the file folders that we're going to allow access to. Similar to what we did last time, I actually get to select the file folder that I want to provide for my SharePoint site developer. So I could actually provide them access here to WSS and both the default website for SharePoint services as well as the administration site. Tell that OK. We'll tell it next. And again, this is pretty much the same stuff here. Now, since I've already added SharePoint to port 21 here, I'm going to need to change the port number to 22. We'll start it automatically, and we could also require SSL and the particular web SSL certificate. And again, we need to allow authentication, and we will use specified users, and we could also use web developer at globalmantics.com, the UPN here as well. We'll go ahead and we'll allow read and write and finish. And now we have a new SharePoint FTP site that is separate and allows the web developer to have access to both the SharePoint 80 site as well as the SharePoint Central Administration website as well. Now, there are a lot more options that I have not gone through because this little FTP guy could actually have a short little about 4-hour course all in and of himself. But just so you know, it's all pretty easy to figure out. It's all pretty easy to wrestle down. A lot of the authentication options and such. I'm going to go ahead and double click on FTP authentication here. We're using basic authentication, using Active Directory and whatnot. Nothing is really rocket science here. It might take you a little bit to figure out what each of these buttons do and what they are. Again, I highly recommend downloading a copy of Server 2008, getting it installed, and poking around on this interface to see what's what and where is it. Okay, our web developer just let us know that there's one more thing that he requires. So let's bounce back on over to the slides and let's talk about it for just a second. Okay, so the developer has requested Simple Mail Transfer Protocol to be installed and configured on SharePoint on the web server for email alerts delivered to users. Now here's the thing, SMTP server is actually a feature that needs to be installed on the web server, but then we also need to configure it separately on the SharePoint site as well. Now what we're doing is we're really creating the ability for SharePoint to be able to send email out to individual users. It's a pretty common feature, and you're probably going to find this request a lot when you have SharePoint sites and when you have folks working on SharePoint sites. So it's a pretty important skill to wrap your head around. The good news is that it's not that hard, all right? So let's go ahead and let's bounce back on over to the server. Let's install the feature first, then I'll show you how to configure on the web server and on SharePoint as well. Alright, so here we are back on Web 1. Let's go ahead and let's install this feature here. We're going to go to the Features section here in Server Manager, and of course we're going to click on Add Features. We're going to scroll right on down, and in order to create the ability for the server to send email, we'll go ahead and we'll put a check mark in SMTP Server, and you'll see once again that it is going to have us install additional components that are required for SMTP to run. Alright, so let's go ahead and let's add the required features. That's a good idea. And we'll go ahead and we'll tell it next. And now we'll go ahead and we'll tell it to install. Now, some of the features sometimes require reboots, some of them do not. It all depends on the feature you're installing. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to pause this guy while it installs. We'll see if it actually requires a reboot or not after it gets done with the installation. Alright, so our installation was successful. Let's go ahead and click on close and let's see if we need to restart our server or not. And I'm not getting any prompting to do so, so it looks like we are A-OK. Alright, so SMTP server is now present. Now let's go ahead and let's see where we need to go to in order to find this little guy. Let's go to the Start menu. And remember that IIS 6.0 manager that we saw previously with the older version of FTP? Well, we're actually going to go back to it now. Let's go ahead and click back onto that IIS 6.0 manager. And let's go ahead and expand this so you can see everything that's happening here. And I'm going to expand, and here is my SMTP virtual server. Well now isn't that interesting? Now let's go ahead and let's take a look at this SMTP virtual server. If we click on domains, you'll notice that this SMTP virtual server is attached to web1-globo.globomantics.com. Okay, let's go ahead and let's right click on the SMTP virtual server. Here's kind of the fun thing, is that SMTP has been set up for us and more or less configured automatically. There's a lot of stuff that we could do to it. We don't necessarily have to though, but I do want to kind of walk you through this properties box just in case you might find yourself needing one of these particular functionalities. Let's go to the access here. Let's click on authentication. Alright. Now currently anonymous access is allowed, so that means that anything on the server can actually access the SMTP server and send email. Now that may or may not be a very good idea for a web server that you're going to put out there to the outside world. You may want to do more something along the lines of integrated Windows authentication to make sure that only a particular account is allowed access to use that SMTP server. Now since this is our SharePoint server that we're setting this up on, and as far as we know, we don't have any plans to publish this server to the outside world, then anonymous access is probably going to be okay. But again, depending upon your security requirements, that may not necessarily be the case. Now I'm going to go ahead and leave it set to anonymous access because I haven't had any requests from my developer that tells me anything else. Alright, so TLS is not available without a certificate. We don't have any certificates configured for SMTP, and our developer has not requested that we set that up just yet. So we're A-OK there. Let's go down here to connection control and click on connections. Select which computers may access this virtual server. So again, we have a very similar thing to what we saw previously with the FTP server. We can decide which computers will get access and which will not. So we can specify all except the list below, which we don't have anything in here, or we can specify only the list below may access this virtual server. So if we want to increase security at this level, we can do so by providing the IP address for only one particular machine. Let's say we only want to allow our web server to have access to this. We'll go ahead and we'll put that web IP address in there. Alright, so now only this one particular server will have access to this SMTP server. Now I think I'm going to go ahead and leave this set up because I don't want too many holes in my web server, even though it is on the inside of my router, and this server is really only going to be used for intranet access. So only this one particular server that we're on, Web 1, will actually have access to this SMTP virtual server service that's running on our Server 2008 machine. Alright, let's take a look here at relay restrictions. Grant or deny permissions to relay email through this SMTP server. Again, similar kind of thing. We're going to make sure that we don't really have an open relay here. We're going to make sure that only this one particular web server has access to relay email back and forth. Alright, so there we go. Let's go to messages. We can limit the size of the messages, limit the session size, limit number of messages per connection, limit number of recipients. This one in particular, I want to point this one out to you. The number of recipients on a SharePoint server, depending on how big our SharePoint server is going to be, how many people are actually using it, if our developer writes a function that requires more than 100 messages or 100 recipients per message to be sent, then we're going to need to up this to however many users we may actually have on the server. Now I'm going to leave it at the default because I happen to know that right now Globomantics is not more than 100 people. So even if my developer does write something that requires basically a broadcast message to all users on the SharePoint server, I know it's not going to be 100, so that's going to be okay. Now, I can also make sure that my web developer gets any non-delivery reports here. So in case we find a bad email address or something like that on the SharePoint server, we're going to go ahead and we're going to have a report sent back to our web developer's email account, which is webdeveloper@globalmatics.com. And of course, you're going to substitute in whatever email address you desire in order to receive any information about any email bounces that happen with this particular message. All right? And then we can also specify a very specific bad mail or a bounced mail if that helps you visualize what's going on here. So if we have a bad email address, let's say that someone has left the company and another IT staffer has actually deleted their email off of the server, then we'll get that email bounced back here and put into the bad mail account. We can put that anywhere we wanted to. I'm going to leave it as it is for right now. All right, delivery. Here's where we set up all of our delivery options. When an email is sent outwards, and by the way, SMTP only sends email outwards. I want to make sure that you understand that. I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit here, but what we're not sending up like a cheap stripped down version of Exchange. That's not what we're doing. Okay, we are not setting up an email send and receive server. All we're doing is creating the ability for the server to send email, not receive it. Okay. All we're doing is allowing this server to send email out to users, so our web developer can write extensions to SharePoint so that he can use that capacity to send alerts to our users and whatever else he might require there. Right, here are the retry intervals. If an email is not able to be sent, the email server that we're sending out to, the email address we're sending it out to, that server will say, hey, you know what? I didn't get something bad happened, then these are the intervals, and you can usually leave these set as the defaults. All right, no worries there. All right, LDAP routing. If we're using LDAP servers for some weird reason, we can enable this. For SharePoint, do we need to? No, we do not. By the way, you might need to enable this though if you're utilizing some other software package or some other application server based type of web script. All right, so this might become more important to you depending upon the requirements of an application that you're installing. All right, let's take a look here in security. Grant operator permissions to these Windows user accounts. These are just the administrator who gets administrative access to this particular SMTP virtual server. Now I'm going to leave this as it is. I'm not going to be granting access to my web developer for this. As the server administrator, there's some restrictions that I do want to keep on my docket rather than put it on to theirs just from a security standpoint. Okay, we'll tell that guy okay. So again, the SMTP server has been basically set up for us. There's not a lot that we really need to do except for install it at this point in time. Now, by the way, we could, if we wanted to, we could create new virtual and additional virtual servers on this web server too if we needed to have additional functionality for other applications. Usually that's not going to be necessary though unless you have an application that very specifically requires multiple SMTP servers. Okay, so this guy is all set up. Let's go ahead and close this out now. And what we're going to do next is we're going to go to our web server and let's make sure that our web server understands that SMTP is now available. And more specifically, we want to make sure that our SharePoint site knows that this is available to us here. So let's go ahead and go into IIS Manager and let's go ahead and turn off our console tree so we can see everything that's happening here. Let's go into Sites. And you'll see, even though I'm still on Web 1 Global Home, you'll see that ASP.NET, there's also already an SMTP email capacity right here. Now, if I go ahead and double click on this, basically, I simply specify the email address that that this particular server is going to be utilizing. Let's say that we're going to have it. We'll say SharePoint@globalmatics.com. This is, by the way, is setting up SMTP email for the entire application server, right? And more specifically for ASP.NET web applications. All right, so we'll go ahead and we'll put a check mark here in localhost because the SMTP virtual server that we want SharePoint to use is installed on this same machine. All right. All right, port 25, as you remember from your Network Plus days, that is the port number that we use for SMTP. Authentication settings, are we going to have a very specific account on the server or in Active Directory send the email, or is it not going to be required? Well, for right now, we're going to leave it be set to not required. Again, depending upon what our web developer tells us later, we may need to come back and we may need to specify Windows credentials or maybe a very specific account that we create just for sending email either on this server or in Active Directory. All right, we can also store email that is sent in a particular directory. Let's go ahead and let's click on Browse here real quick. Let's go ahead and set up a quick file folder for any email that does get sent. I'm going to be placing that here in inetpub. We'll make a new folder and we'll just call this sent email. We'll tell it OK. So any email that does get sent, well, there will be a copy stored here in this sent email folder. All right, we'll click on apply and our changes have been saved successfully. All right, now let's go to our SharePoint box here, our SharePoint site, and let's scroll down here. Let's take a look and see what we have in this SMTP email. Again, we do need to have this guy set up as a global, where I'll also probably need to have it set up on the individual SharePoint site as well. So let's go ahead and let's simply put in our email address. We're going to use localhost. All of this stuff is pretty much the same. Okay, so we'll click on apply, and now that allows SharePoint 80, that one particular SharePoint site, to utilize SMTP email, and also allows our developer to have SMTP capabilities for SharePoint. All right, so this is what we've done on the server side. Next, what we need to do is we need to go to the SharePoint Central Administration site, and let's make sure it's set up and configured there. Let me show you where that's at. We have not yet seen the SharePoint Central Administration site, but you're going to find that by going to the Start menu, Administrative Tools, and SharePoint 3.0 Central Administration. And of course, it's going to open up in a web browser. Now keep in mind that the Central Administration site was created. We didn't have to do anything with the exception of run that initial configuration wizard. All right, so now it's going to prompt me for credentials. I'm going to be logging in with the local administrative credentials, which is just administrator because I have not yet changed that particular account name. And since you are the administrator of this box and you know what the local administrator password is, and I think I'm actually logged in. Yeah, I'm logged in as a local administrator here. You can always utilize a local administrative account to provide you at least initial access for configuring SharePoint. Now, eventually, you're probably going to want to create separate administrator accounts for SharePoint inside of SharePoint itself, providing full control over SharePoint as it is. But that's a whole different lesson for a whole different day. I want to point out to you here real quick the URL that it is pointing us to. Wow, is it taking a long time to load up for the first time we are, because I haven't actually accessed this site at all, so it's just taking just a bit of time to load up. But I want you to notice here that we're accessing a very specific port. Now the port that I'm accessing is 14453. When you install SharePoint, by the way, this port will change. This is actually a randomly generated port value based upon ports that are available on the server at that time. So keep that in mind when you're looking at your own SharePoint installation, that you will probably not be accessing it using 14453. It might be 8908 or any variation of random port numbers that happen to be available at the time when you run your configuration script. Alright, so here we go. Here is our central administration page. We're going to go to the application management section for this particular central administration point. We're going to scroll down here. Web application outgoing email settings. There we go. Let's go ahead and click on that link. And now all we need to do is basically specify what our SMTP server is. Now we know that our SMTP server is web1-globo.globomantics.com, which is just our server that we're on because we're basically using the local host. So our from address is going to be SharePoint at globomantics.com. And even though that address may or may not exist on an Exchange server, it doesn't matter. All we're doing is sending email, we're not receiving it. And then a reply to address, we're going to put in here web developer. This is going to be the reply address that is included in the email itself, so that way if a user wants to reply to an automated email, that email will get sent back to the web developer. So he may not be very happy that we're setting that up, but that's going to be okay because SharePoint is his baby. All right, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to tell this guy okay. Oh, you know what? Before we do that here, let's click here on this Learn About Configuring Email Settings. The nice thing about SharePoint is that they've done a fantastic job of doing a lot of solid documentation here. So anytime that you get a little bit stuck, you can actually go into the help section and find some great information in terms of, just a little bit of extra help in case you don't have time to go back and pop in this CD. Anytime you see those Learn About links, and you'll see here in the mail settings, type the SMTP server name for outbound email. Notice that it tells us that it wants the server name, not the IP address, right? Because if we wanted to put in the IP address, what we would have done is we would have put in 127.0.0.1. That's not what it asks for, right? It asks for the name of the server. All right, so just want to show those to you here real quick. I'm really a huge fan of SharePoint, just so you know. I think Microsoft has done a fantastic job with this particular application. I'm going to go ahead and tell this guy OK. And now, at this stage in the game, our server has now been set up for SMTP. Our SharePoint site has also been, our SharePoint administration section has also been set up so SharePoint can utilize SMTP. So our job is now done. We have created access for our SharePoint developer. We have given him everything that he needs. We've given him management access of the SharePoint site. We've given him FTP access, and we've also set up SMTP so the scripts that he writes can utilize that SMTP send mail capacity that I can guarantee he's going to want to have. Okay, friends, let's go ahead and go on back over to the slides, and let's do some wrap up. Alright, so let's go ahead and let's talk about some webby words to remember here. First of all, FTP, File Transfer Protocol, is an easy way to transfer files up and back and forth to a website. And I've actually shown you two different ways to set up FTP. Remember that the built-in FTP on Server 2008, when you install it as a role service, that is an unsecure FTP, okay? Which for the most part is probably going to be okay as long as your server is on the inside of your network perimeter. So for our SharePoint site, the built-in FTP is probably going to be a-okay. But if we want to use secure FTP, remember you need to go out to IIS.net and download that new FTP manager for IIS 7.0. Send Mail Transfer Protocol is a simple email service. It's easy to set up on both the server itself, on websites that you want to have access to that server, as well as in SharePoint. Okay? IIS Manager User. Remember that an IIS Manager User is a user account that is separate from Active Directory, and is specifically only for managing IIS from a remote console, and that's all that it's used for. The IIS 7.0 Manager, remember, is a downloadable console for remote management of IIS 7 from an XP or a Vista client, or you could even put it on a Server 2003 machine. Now, don't confuse the IIS 7.0 Manager with the FTP Manager service for IIS 7.0. Okay, remember, those are two different things altogether. The IIS 7.0 Manager downloadable that we take a look at here in this particular course is so that our web developer can manage settings on the website. Okay? But the FTP Manager, that's something we install on the server so that our web developer can use pretty much any FTP client that he wants as long as it supports secure FTP to transfer encrypted files back and forth from the server, if in fact the encryption is enabled. And last we saw our SharePoint Central Administration website. Remember, the SharePoint Central Administration website is a separate website that gets created during the installation of SharePoint, and it's for high-level administration of SharePoint. You can create SharePoint sites from there and manage most of the higher-level administrative tasks from that particular site that you can't get anywhere else, by the way. Okay. Alright, so let's talk about what you should be able to do after watching this video. You should be able to enable remote management for IIS 7. You should be able to create IIS manager accounts for use with the IIS Management Console. You should be able to enable access for an IIS manager account on a particular website. Then you should also be able to download and install the IIS 7 Manager Console for remote access on, say, like a Vista or XP client. You should be able to install and configure FTP on IIS 7. It's actually in two ways now, right? Again, depending upon if you need secure file transfers or if you don't. You should be able to install and configure SMTP on Server 2008 and in SharePoint services. And we saw that particular operation, wow, that was really probably the easiest thing we did in the whole video, right? We installed it and we told our websites and our servers basically where it was. And we did that in a couple of different places. Okay, so that wraps up this video, friends. Let's go ahead and let's move on to the next one.